So I want to begin by quoting the first paragraphs of an article that I published last year with Jeffrey Quilter of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. It introduces a group of articles that we edited from papers delivered at a symposium that I co-organized at Harvard in 2006 called Crossing Boundaries, Art and Anthropology Museums in Search of Common Ground. And I think it succinctly introduces a set of puzzles that I hope we might discuss today. We consider the things people make artifacts according to various disciplinary conventions, including those of anthropology, archaeology, art history, history, philosophy, and sociology. What are the relationships among these disciplines in respect of museums, the scholarly institutions that research and present artifacts? The various types of museums, of art, of anthropology, of history, natural history, and science, have largely operated in separate spheres. Increasingly, the rationale for their institutional boundaries is coming under conceptual pressure. In particular, changing ideas about class, race, ethnicity, and culture, in part generated within museums themselves, challenge the boundary between art and anthropology museums. How might art and anthropology museums, while sustaining their disciplinary commitments, find ways of sharing not only ideas, but even their collections? So let's take a closer look at some of these claims. In particular, I want to set in play the fundamental idea that museums, as presently constituted, simply no longer embody the way in which many of us conceive of the systematics of the world. That is, how the world can best be divided up and categorized, how we analyze the world. Now, there was a time when Westerners and some others distinguished between what we might call civilizations and cultures. In this schema, civilizations are largely sedentary, use plough agriculture, at least on the Eurasian landmass, though it would be hard to imagine this guy using a plough, have a conspicuous urban component, employ the technology of writing, and have histories. And as a representative of civilizations in this sense, I'm showing you Dosso Dossi's Condottieri of about 1520 in the Fogg Art Museum. Cultures, on the other hand, may be sedentary, but are likely to have a notable nomadic or seasonal movement component. If they're not entirely dependent on hunting and gathering, they use hoe cultivation. And while they may have long-term cult or population centers, they're not predominantly urban. Further, they commit their records to memory, transmitted orally, and by means of visual representation, and supposedly are without histories. And as a representative of oral culture, as seen by a member of a civilization, as I've just defined it, I show you John White's watercolor in the British Museum of a native of Virginia, as it's still called, although what's called Virginia today is an attenuated area in comparison with what the British called Virginia in the 16th century. In the opinion of these Westerners, they themselves and selected societies on the Eurasian landmass are civilized and therefore relatively removed from nature. They produce art. The others, once designated as savages by Westerners, are supposedly in a state close to nature. They produce artifacts. Certain products of the civilized Europeans, their diaspora, here represented by the Stoughton cup made by the Boston goldsmith John Coney in 1701, are amenable to aesthetic attention as art, in the sense proposed by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of the Power of Judgment of 1790, the third critique. Now, in such cases, each object is ostensibly characterized by attributes unique to it, Europeans acknowledge that certain other peoples they consider to be civilized also produced art in the same sense, that is, exhibiting unique attributes. These include objects made by some carefully selected Asians, porcelain made by Chinese specialists, for instance, and even by some ancient Americans. And in that case, we should bear in mind that for ideological reasons to do with post-Emersonian particularism, some Euro-Americans co-opted the surviving products of urban American societies that flourished prior to the arrival of Europeans as an alternative antiquity. Such Euro-Americans were thereby trying to reinforce the distinction they claimed for themselves from their originating societies in Europe itself. Now, all these things, certain European diasporic objects, certain Asian objects, and certain ancient American objects, have come to be accepted by hegemonic society as art. They thereby have joined the body of European fine art defined as such in the late 18th century and taken up by those institutions founded in those years that have done so much to refine and disseminate such definitions. Those institutions? Art museums. Now, by contrast, these same arbiters of hegemonic values, some within art museums and some in other Euro institutions that propound a dominating systematics, view the products of cultures supposedly close to nature as craft objects, and as such, devoid of the beauty defined by Immanuel Kant in the Third Critique as proper to the fine arts. They treat these things, therefore, as specimens, each no more than representative of its kind. And this is the basis of both the historical and anthropological uses of tangible objects. We all know the consequences as far as museums are concerned. Ostensibly unique products of favored societies, even favored sections of certain favored societies, exist as art in art museums. And here's a group of Roman Baroque terracottas in the fog. They're fabulous. The representative tangible objects of the material culture of oral societies, supposedly close to nature, exist as specimens in anthropology and natural history museums. And I show you a typical ethnographic museum vitrine, Great Lakes Indians in the Milwaukee Public Museum. Even the same kind of material, Papuan ancestor boards in this instance, is treated radically differently in the two kinds of museums. Often crowded and overlapping in wall cases, as in the Horniman Museum in London, an anthropology museum, a very fine museum, given space to register as independent objects of aesthetic attention, as in the De Young Museum in San Francisco. However, this schema, unique artworks in art museums, representative specimens in anthropology and natural history museums, came under pressure even as it achieved its classic realization in the art and natural history museums of Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Received opinion holds that it was in these years that some Western artists challenged normative notions of what constitutes art. Now, if we accept this claim, which I think is basically reasonable, we can also acknowledge that this challenge occurred in two principal modes. One consists in artists' appropriations from within contemporary Western material culture of, in the philosopher Arthur Danto's phrase, mere real things. That is, material things that, while human-made, are not artworks. And you all know the standard example. Fountain, a pseudonymously signed urinal that Marcel Duchamp unsuccessfully attempted to exhibit in New York in 1917. And it became known through this photograph of it by Alfred Stieglitz. The second mode of challenge to prevailing norms was some Western artists' embrace of the so-called primitive by appropriating forms from colonially subjugated societies, predominantly in Oceania and sub-Saharan Africa. And, of course, many point to Paul Gauguin and Pablo Picasso as prominent among artists who took the lead in expanding the Western repertory in response to the arts of these, to Europeans, exotic places. As well as artists, some collectors and scholars also adopted indigenous art itself, exhibiting and discussing it in aesthetic terms previously reserved for the art of what they had considered to be civilized societies. Famously, throughout the 20th century, dealers and curators took masquerades from African, Melanesian, Pacific Coast, Native American, and other indigenous societies and stripped them of their fiber and other supposedly extraneous components to reduce them so as to conform as far as possible to Western patterns and expectations of clean-cut carving, the mask. A photograph made in 1926 by Man Ray, an American working in Paris, Noir et Blanche, exemplifies this kind of appropriation. Now, such appropriation was largely supersessive. That is, Western concerns overrode any significance that such things might have had for indigenous makers and users. Nonetheless, a true expansion of Western ideas about what constitutes art came about. Consider the matter in terms of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's principle of family resemblance, to define membership of a kind. Now, if a Weitstoss and a Canova are close to one another, neither is close in terms of underlying premises, even those of Western appropriators, to a Congo Nkisi figure or a Biwat flute stopper. Yet progressively in the 20th century and beyond, all four have functioned in hegemonic European terms as art. In the course of the 20th century, Western artists, scholars, and collectors not only re-evaluated the previously denigrated idols and fetishes of colonized indigenous peoples, they began to look to aspects of their own previously ignored cultural traditions. They explored beyond the narrow range of Western artifacts related to an equally narrow range of material from Mediterranean classical antiquity that their predecessors had assumed art to be. For instance, as well as finding inspiration in the displays of African art he saw in the Ethnographic Museum in the Palais du Trocadero in Paris from 1907 onwards, Picasso emulated Iberian so-called folk sculpture, notably the recently excavated pre-Roman Iberian reliefs from Osuna and Cerro de los Santos in Spain, which were exhibited at the Louvre the previous year. And in 1908, the Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancuș, working in Paris, created what would retrospectively be seen as his first characteristically modern sculpture, introducing the archaic European primitive into Western high art. The primitive, wherever it was to be found, whether among subjugated peoples beyond Europe, in Europe's deep past, or in the products of its underclasses, acquired cachet as both directly expressive and uncontaminated by sophistication. Even so, scholars tend to define perceived values in primitive art, whether exotic or folk, in terms of the values they ascribed to the art of Mediterranean classical antiquity. For instance, Roger Fry responded to Cuba and other art from the Congo in his sympathetic essay, Negro Sculpture at the Chelsea Book Club, published in the Athenaeum in 1920, as nothing so much as another viable form of antiquity. Far from remaining a scarcely regarded occasional exhibition review, this article was republished in Fry's vastly influential volume of essays of 1920, Vision and Design, in which he also admiringly discussed the art of the Bushman and ancient American art, as well as the art of Florentine Renaissance painters Albrecht Dürer, William Blake, Paul Cézanne, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir. It took Franz Boas, in his still remarkable book, Primitive Art, of 1927, to propose a radical break. And this is my ideal of what a scholar should be getting up to. Boas's pioneering work draws on an extraordinary breadth of knowledge of world cultures, in addition to his extensive and empathetic fieldwork among the indigenous peoples of the coastal region of what's now called British Columbia. In its wake, no one has been able to demonstrate either cultural inequality among peoples or an evolution from savagery to civilization. Unfortunately, though, many have asserted these things in spite of Boas's work and the work of others, often in terms of outright racism, frequently with disastrous consequences.